Son asked me to come early to help set up for Easter. That was the reason he gave anyway. I'd been making my deviled eggs for 30 years, and he said the grandkids had been asking for them. I felt wanted. That's what I remember most about that morning. I felt genuinely wanted. I'm 64 years old. I know that doesn't sound ancient, and I don't feel ancient, but somewhere in the last few years, I'd started to feel like furniture in my own family. Present, functional, not really seen. I pulled into my son's driveway at 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the rest of the family was due to arrive. The April air was cool and clean, the kind of morning that makes you feel like something good might happen. I had my deviled eggs in a carrier on the passenger seat and a bag of tulips from the farmer's market on the floor. My daughter-in-law had mentioned once, years ago, that tulips were her favorite flower. I'd remembered. The front door was unlocked. I let myself in the way he'd told me to, calling out a soft hello as I came through the entryway. No answer. The house was quiet in that particular way. Houses are when people are nearby but unaware of you. I could hear voices from the back, past the kitchen, out through the sliding door that led to the covered patio. They'd left it open about 4 inches. I set my eggs on the counter. I was going to call out again. Then I heard my son's voice, low and focused the way it gets when he's talking about money. The assessed value is already over 600. Once she's gone, that's real money, Scott. That's not nothing. Scott is my son-in-law, my daughter's husband. I stood completely still next to the kitchen counter. Does she have a will? That was Scott. She's got something from years ago. Dad's name is still on everything, I think. My son again. She doesn't talk about it. But she's not getting any younger. The smart thing would be to start figuring out the logistics. A pause. The sound of a chair scraping on concrete. Then my daughter's voice, quieter but clear enough. She's not sick, though. Could be another 20 years. Could be, but Dad's heart stuff was genetic, right? And she's been on blood pressure meds for, 5 years now. My son. Casual. Reasonable. Like he was discussing a business timeline. I'm just saying we should be smart about it. Know where things stand. My daughter, again, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The part of her that knew this was wrong even if she was standing there participating. I just don't want to think about it. You don't have to think about it. I'm thinking about it. That's the whole point. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my hand went cold against the counter. Long enough to replay the words twice, make sure I hadn't misheard. I hadn't misheard. I picked up my deviled egg carrier and quietly put it in the refrigerator. Then I took the tulips out of the bag, found a vase in the third cabinet where my daughter-in-law had always kept them, filled it with water, and arranged the flowers on the dining table. By the time my son came in through the sliding door, I was washing my hands at the kitchen sink. "Mom, hey, you're here." He kissed my cheek. He smelled like coffee and spring air, and he had no idea I'd heard a single word. "Sorry, we were just outside. How long have you been here?" "Just a minute," I said. "Just got in." "The eggs are already in there." "In the fridge," I said. "I'll plate them when everyone arrives." He smiled at me. My son, the baby I brought home from the hospital 38 years ago, the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and tell me they were as beautiful as roses. I looked at him and I felt something settle in my chest, like sediment in still water. Not rage, not even grief exactly. Clarity. The Easter gathering was 14 people, my son and his wife, my daughter and Scott, 4 grandchildren, ranging from 6 to 15. My son's in-laws, who were kind people I'd never quite managed to feel close to. 2 of the kids' friends who'd been invited at the last minute. I served deviled eggs. I helped set the table. I played a card game with the grandchildren after dinner and let the 6-year-old win twice on purpose. When my daughter hugged me goodbye in the driveway, she held on a beat too long, the way people do when they feel guilty about something they haven't admitted to yet. "I love you, Mom," she said. "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, because I did. That was the thing I had to keep reminding myself of on the drive home. I loved them. I had just learned something true about them that I hadn't known before or hadn't let myself know. I'd worked in estate law for 26 years. Not as an attorney, I was a paralegal, then an office manager, then eventually the person the attorneys trusted with their most complicated cases because I had a memory for detail and I didn't make mistakes. I'd spent more hours than I could count sitting across from adult children who were surprised, genuinely, sometimes bitterly surprised, to discover that a parent had made different arrangements than expected. I knew what those conversations looked like from the other side of the desk. I drove home to the house on Clementine Drive that Walter and I had bought in 1991. 4 bedrooms, a yard with 2 apple trees he'd planted the first spring we were there, a kitchen we'd renovated together in 2003, arguing over cabinet colors for 3 weeks and then laughing about it for years. Walter had been gone for 4 years. Heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March. Quick and unexpected, the kind that the cardiologist later told me was probably over before he felt it. I'd been downstairs making coffee. I'd been waiting for him to come down and tell me about whatever he'd been reading the night before, because he always did that, always had some fact or idea he wanted to share over the first cup. He never came down. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea and sat in the kitchen in the quiet. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because people assume you must be furious, and I understand why they assume that, but anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something colder and more useful. I felt like a person who had just been handed the correct information and now needed to decide what to do with it. I'd always assumed I would die in this house. I'd said it out loud, actually, at a family dinner a couple of years ago. Said something about wanting to stay right here forever, and my son had said, "Of course, Mom, obviously," and changed the subject. I'd thought it was discomfort with the topic of death. Now I understood the discomfort differently. I opened my laptop. I called my friend Louise the next morning. Louise had been my closest friend for 22 years, since our kids were in middle school together. She'd lost her husband 2 years before I lost Walter, and she'd navigated the aftermath of that with a practicality I'd always admired. About a year ago, she'd sold her house and moved to a 55-plus community in Scottsdale. She'd mentioned it almost apologetically when she told me, like she was confessing something embarrassing. She picked up on the second ring. "Happy day after Easter," I said. "How was dinner?" "Quiet," she said. "Just me and a few people from down here. How was yours?" "Educational," I said. There was a pause. Louise had known me long enough to understand what a pause after a word like that meant. What happened? I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I kept my voice even, about my house, about the assessed value, about what happens when I'm gone. Another pause. Longer this time. "Oh, Elaine," she said. "Elaine. That's my name. I should have said so earlier. I'm not sure why I didn't." "I want to ask you about Scottsdale," I said. We talked for an hour. She told me about the community she'd found. A place called the Saguaro. Independent living, beautiful grounds, a pool, a community center with more organized activities than she had time for, restaurants and shopping nearby. She'd been resistant to the idea for 2 years before she finally went and looked at it and understood that she'd been confusing independence with isolation. "Come see it," she said. "Come this week." "I might do that," I said. I flew to Scottsdale on Thursday. Louise picked me up from the airport and we went straight there. The saguaro was low and terracotta-colored, built around 2 central courtyards with fountain features and desert landscaping. It looked nothing like what I'd pictured when I heard senior living. It looked like somewhere a person would choose to be, not somewhere they'd been placed. I toured a 1-bedroom unit with a sunroom that looked out over a mountain view. Louise introduced me to a woman named Clara from down the hall, who'd been a high school principal for 30 years and who was currently training for a 5K. I toured the pool. I sat in the courtyard in the warm afternoon light and felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't even realized had been tight. "How much?" I asked the leasing manager, a calm woman named Pam who answered without the slightest hint of sales pressure. She told me it was significant but not beyond reach, especially with the sale of the house. When would something be available? I asked. We have a unit opening up in August, she said, another one in November. I looked at Louise. August, I said. Pam blinked just slightly. You'd like to put down a deposit today? I'd like to put down a deposit today, I said. On the flight home, I thought about Walter. He would have liked Arizona. He'd always talked about the light there, said he wanted to see the desert at dawn at least once before he died. We'd never made it. I was going to make it now, and I was going to make it permanent. The following Tuesday, I called a woman named Barbara Okafor, an estate attorney who'd been recommended to me by 3 different people over the years. I'd never needed her before. I needed her now. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, glass and chrome, a view of the city on a clear morning. She was exactly what I expected. Thorough, unflappable, the kind of person who'd heard everything and judged nothing. I need to revise my will, I told her, significantly. She opened a new file. Tell me what you're thinking. I'd spent 3 days thinking about it carefully, not emotionally. I was done with the emotional part. Analytically, the way I'd spent 26 years thinking about other people's estates. My current will divided everything equally between my son and my daughter. Standard, simple. I'd done it years ago and never revisited it. I want to establish educational trusts for my 4 grandchildren, I said. Equal amounts to be held until each of them reaches 25, inaccessible to their parents before that point. Barbara was making notes, and the remainder of the estate. I want 15% to go to the Alzheimer's Association, 15% to a Children's Literacy Foundation. I'll give you a list of ones I've researched, 10% to a local hospice organization. I paused. The rest I want distributed among other charitable organizations at your discretion. You can research who's doing effective work. I trust your judgment. Barbara's pen stopped. She looked at me over her glasses. That leaves your children with nothing from the estate beyond the grandchildren's trusts. I'm aware of that. I have to ask, is this decision coming from a place of conflict or distress? I ask because it's your job, I said. I understand. The answer is no. I'm not distressed. I'm not acting out of anger. I'm acting out of information I received that changed how I understand my situation. I kept my voice level. I've spent 26 years working in this field. I know exactly what I'm doing. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and picked up her pen. All right. Given the circumstances, I'd recommend a revocable living trust structure. It'll give you flexibility during your lifetime and be significantly harder to contest after. That's exactly what I want, I said. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. I had organized files, clear records, account numbers, and property deeds, and investment statements in a binder I'd kept updated every year since Walter died. Barbara complimented my documentation 3 times. I'd been complimented on my documentation my entire career. It had never felt more useful. When I left her office, I stopped at the coffee shop on the ground floor and ordered a latte and sat by the window for 20 minutes just watching people walk by on the street. A young woman with a stroller. 2 men in suits arguing cheerfully about something. A teenager on a skateboard. All of these people living their lives in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, none of them waiting for anything. I thought, that's what I want, to stop waiting. I called a real estate agent that week. His name was Danny Park, sharp and efficient, someone who'd sold 3 properties on my street in the last 2 years. He came by on Saturday, walked every room, took measurements, stood in the backyard under the apple trees and looked at the yard thoughtfully. It's a really strong market right now, he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. I think we could list at 480, maybe 490, and I wouldn't be surprised if we got multiple offers in the first week. Good, I said. List it June 1st. I want a clean transition. Close by mid-July, I'm moving in August. He glanced up from his notes. That's a tight timeline. I know. Can you do it? I can do it. He clicked his pen. You've talked to your family about this? Everyone kept asking me that. It's my house and my decision, I said. Yes or no on the timeline. Yes, he said. In the weeks that followed, I did what needed to be done. I went through 33 years of accumulated life with methodical attention. The house on Clementine Drive held everything: children's artwork in folders I'd kept since kindergarten, holiday decorations that filled 4 boxes in the attic, Walter's tools organized in his workshop the way he'd always kept them, a closet in the spare room full of my sons' and daughters' things that they'd left behind when they moved out and never came back for. I packed their childhood things carefully, labeled boxes with their names. Soccer cleats and yearbooks and prom photos and the handmade cards my son had given me every Mother's Day until he was 13. I arranged the boxes in the garage and decided to have them delivered rather than call and explain. The rest of the house I sorted room by room: keep, donate, sell. Most of it was donate. Furniture I'd had for decades, books, kitchen equipment for a kitchen I wouldn't be cooking full meals in anymore, Walter's workshop tools. I donated those to a vocational training program for teenagers, which felt right. My daughter called 3 times in May. Normal conversations. How was I feeling? What were my plans? Had I been getting out enough? She asked once if I was eating well, in that slightly worried tone that I now understood had less to do with me and more to do with her discomfort with uncertainty. I told her I was fine, getting out plenty, eating well. My son called twice. Both times we talked about the grandchildren. His oldest had made the travel soccer team. His youngest had started reading chapter books on her own. I asked questions and listened and kept my voice warm because I loved those grandchildren fiercely, and that had nothing to do with anything else. He mentioned once that his car was going to need a new transmission. One of those mentions that used to function as a kind of prompt, the careful leaving open of a door. I said, "That's really frustrating. Those repairs are so expensive." And then I changed the subject. There was a silence on his end that lasted just a beat too long. I kept moving. June 1st, the house went on the market. Danny sent me the listing photos on a Tuesday evening. I looked at every room in the photographs: the kitchen we'd renovated, the apple trees in the yard, the living room where Walter and I had spent thousands of ordinary evenings, and I felt something. Not regret, not sadness exactly, more like the particular feeling of finishing a chapter and closing the book gently. Gratitude for what had been, readiness for something else. We had 3 offers by that Friday. One was full price, cash, with a requested close date in mid-July. "Take it," I told Danny. "Done," he said. I drove to Scottsdale in mid-July with 2 carloads of what I was keeping. Louise helped me unload boxes and we ordered takeout from the Thai place near her building and sat on my new patio in the warm evening and talked until nearly midnight. Frank's ashes, I kept meaning to say Walter. Walter's ashes were in the carved box I'd kept on my dresser for 4 years. I set them on the windowsill in the sunroom that night, facing the mountains. "Not yet," I told him, "but soon." The Saguaro orientation was the following Monday. I met my neighbors on the floor: a retired nurse named Cecilia, who was warm and funny, a former journalist named Philip, who had opinions about everything and expressed them with great enthusiasm, a quiet woman named Adele, who'd moved from Minnesota the previous winter and was still getting used to the light. Louise came to the welcome coffee and introduced me around like a proud older sister. "How are you settling in?" Cecilia asked me over coffee in the common room later that week. "Strange," I said. "Good strange." She laughed. "That's exactly how it was for me. Like you took off a coat you'd been wearing so long you forgot it was there." I knew what she meant. I'd been so many things for so long: Walter's wife, my children's mother, the person who remembered everyone's preferences and kept the house running and made the deviled eggs every Easter without being asked. I was still those things, the good versions of them. But I was also, for the first time in a very long time, simply myself. I took the watercolor class that started in September. I was genuinely terrible. I found it enormously satisfying. I joined a book club that read 1 novel a month and argued about it over wine on the 3rd Thursday. I went on the community trip to Sedona and stood at the edge of a red rock overlook at sunset and felt something in my chest open up that I'd forgotten was closed. I volunteered Tuesday mornings at a literacy center downtown, helping adults who were learning to read for the first time. One of them, a 61-year-old man named Arthur, who'd spent his whole life hiding the fact that he couldn't read, finished his first full book in November. I cried in the car on the way home and then called Louise to tell her about it and cried again. I was busy, I was present, I was alive in a way I hadn't been since before Walter died. My son's call came on a Saturday morning in August. I'd just come back from a walk and was making coffee when my phone lit up with his name. I answered. "Mom." His voice was off. "Careful. I need to talk to you." "Okay," I said. "Danny Park. He reached out to me about some paperwork, something about the Clementine Drive sale, and I started putting some things together." A pause. "The house is gone." "Yes," I said. "And you moved. You're in Arizona." "I am." "Mom." His voice cracked slightly just at the edges. "What is going on? Why didn't you tell us?" I poured my coffee and sat down at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought new for the new apartment, smaller than the one on Clementine Drive and exactly the right size for one person. I looked out the sunroom window at the mountains in the morning light. "I came early to Easter," I said. "I let myself in the way you asked me to, and I heard you on the patio talking to Scott about the house, about the assessed value, about the timeline." Silence. "I know what I heard," I said. "I'm not angry. I want you to understand that. But I spent the last 4 years living in that house feeling like I was already halfway gone, and I didn't realize how much of that was my own choice, and how much of it was the way you and your sister had started to see me. I kept my voice even. I needed to make different choices, so I did." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower. Something stripped out of it. "I'm sorry, Mum." "I know you are." That conversation, we never should have. I didn't know how to explain what was going through my head. "You were scared about money," I said. "I understand that. Being scared about money makes people think things they shouldn't think. But I wasn't the solution to your financial problems, and I'm not willing to be a problem you're just waiting to have resolved." Another long silence. "Is there anything," he started again. "Did you change your will?" "I did," I said. "Your children will be taken care of. There are trusts for each of them, but the rest is going to people who need it." He didn't say anything about that. I think somewhere underneath his shock he understood that he had no grounds on which to argue. "Can I call you?" he asked. "Can we talk?" "Not about any of that. Just can we still talk?" "Yes," I said. "Call me. Tell me about the grandchildren. Tell me what's happening in your life. I want to know." "Okay," he said. "Okay." My daughter called 2 days later. That conversation was harder and went longer. She cried. She said she was ashamed of herself, that she'd known in the moment that standing on that patio was wrong, and she'd done it anyway because she'd been scared and small, and had let her husband lead her somewhere she shouldn't have gone. She said she'd been thinking about it for months, even before I said anything. That something had been nagging at her since Easter, some guilt she couldn't identify and couldn't shake. I believe her, that's the thing. I know my daughter well enough to know when she's being honest, and she was being honest. "I don't want to be someone who treated you like that," she said. "I need you to know that." "I do know that," I said, "and I want you to know that I'm not gone, sweetheart. I'm right here. I'm just living my own life now." She came to visit in October, flew in with the 2 grandchildren, spent a long weekend. We went to the Desert Botanical Garden, and the kids ran up and down the paths, pointing at cacti and my daughter, and I walked slowly behind them and talked. Really talked, the way we hadn't in years. About her marriage and her anxieties and the ways she'd been letting fear drive decisions she should have been making from somewhere calmer. About Walter and how much she missed her father and how that grief had gone sideways in ways she hadn't recognized. When she left on Sunday afternoon, she hugged me at the airport and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'm coming back in February for my birthday." "Good," I said. "I'll plan something." My son and I found our footing more slowly. He came out in November, alone, left his wife and kids in Denver, and flew to Scottsdale for a weekend, which was an unusual thing for him to do, and told me something about how seriously he was taking it. We went to dinner on the first night, and it was stiff and careful, and we both knew it. The second day we walked in the desert for 2 hours, and something loosened. He talked about the financial pressure he'd been under, the way his mortgage had outpaced his income, the slow creep of decisions that had compounded into a situation he didn't know how to talk about. He wasn't asking me to fix it. He was explaining it, which was different. "I know that doesn't make what I said okay," he told me. "No," I agreed, "but it helps me understand it." We ate dinner that night at a place Louise had recommended, on a patio under strings of lights, with the mountains dark against the sky. And we talked about his father for the first time in a long time. Really talked about him, told stories, the funny ones, the ones I'd forgotten about until he reminded me. We laughed. Before he flew home the next morning, he hugged me at the rideshare pickup and said, "I'm glad you're here, Mom. I'm glad you're okay." "I'm better than okay," I said, because I was. The following spring, on a clear March morning with Louise and Cecilia beside me, I drove to the south rim of the Grand Canyon. I'd never been, somehow, in 64 years of living in the American West. We got there at dawn, stood at the edge, watched the light come over the canyon in waves of pink and gold that turned the whole thing into something that didn't look real. I had Water's ashes in a small container in my jacket pocket. I'd carried them from the windowsill in the sunroom, to the car, to this edge. I didn't say anything dramatic. There was nothing to say that the morning didn't already say better. I just let go. Driving back, Cecilia was asleep in the back seat. Louise was looking out the window at the desert passing by in the early light. After a while, she said, without looking at me, "How do you feel?" I thought about the question, the house on Clementine Drive, and what I'd overheard on a Tuesday morning in April. The attorney's office on the 14th floor, the flight to Scottsdale and the patio in the evening, and the way the mountains looked at dawn. My daughter's voice on the phone saying, "I don't want to be someone who treated you like that." My son's face across a dinner table in November when he finally stopped being careful. Arthur reading his first book at 61. "I feel like myself," I said. Louise looked at me then and smiled. That was enough, more than enough, that it turned out was everything. I keep coming back to the moment I stood in that kitchen with my hand cold against the counter. The turkey wasn't even on yet. The flowers I'd bought my daughter-in-law were still in the bag, and the people I'd given the better part of my life to were outside on the patio talking about my house like it was already theirs. What I did next, or rather, what I didn't do, was the thing that changed everything. I didn't storm out, I didn't cry, I didn't confront anyone over the deviled eggs while the rest of the family was on their way over. I arranged the tulips, I washed my hands, and I got quiet in a way I'd never quite managed before. That quietness wasn't weakness, it was the first genuinely clear-headed decision I'd made in years. And I think that's the part worth sitting with. There's a version of this story where I act out of hurt, and it costs me, where I say something I can't take back, push my children away before I've given them any chance to reckon with what they'd done, and end up bitter and isolated. I've seen that version play out in other people's lives. The wound becomes the whole story. But when you let yourself get still first, when you think before you move, you give yourself the chance to act from something more solid than pain. That's what saved me, I think. Not cleverness, not luck, just the discipline to wait until I knew what I actually wanted. Because what I wanted wasn't revenge. I want to be honest about that. Rewriting my will and selling the house. Those weren't punishments, even if they felt that way to my son and daughter at first. They were choices I made for myself, out of self-respect, after a very long period of not making those kinds of choices at all. 26 years in estate law had taught me that the people who end up with regrets are usually the ones who never got around to deciding what they actually valued. I knew what I valued. I just needed one overheard conversation on a Tuesday morning in April to remind me. And here's the part I think about most now. Standing on a patio in Scottsdale, with the mountains turning gold in the evening, the outcome followed directly from what each person chose to do with the truth. My daughter felt the wrongness of what she'd done while she was still standing on that patio. She carried that guilt for months before I said a word. When the conversation finally came, she didn't make excuses. She sat with me and told the truth about her fear and her smallness and her genuine wish to be different. That took something real, and because of it, we found our way back to each other. My son took longer. He had more defending to do before he could set it down. But he did set it down in a canyon at sunset over dinner, laughing about his father. That took something real too. What you do when you're caught, not by someone else, but by your own conscience, that's the truest measure of who you are. I'm not the same woman who drove to Easter with deviled eggs and a bag of tulips, feeling grateful just to be included. I know who I am now. I know what I'm worth. And I know the difference between being loved and being waited on. Walter used to say the kindest thing you could do for yourself was to tell the truth about your own life. I didn't understand what he meant for a long time. I do now.